Horror hounds, it's time to take a trip back in time to 1958. What Hammer Studios had successfully done with the Frankenstein legend, they were going to now do to Dracula. The film's called Dracula here in the UK. It changed its title to Horror of Dracula in the US, supposedly to avoid any confusion with Universal's 1931 Dracula, which starred Bela Lugosi. Not that audiences would be left under any illusion that this was a new count for a new generation. During the opening of the movie, the camera finds Castle Dracula's sepulchre and then the Count's stone coffin. As it closes in on the Dracula name carved into that sarcophagus, bright red blood starts dripping down onto the Dracula nameplate. This is a new studio and a new Dracula for a new generation.
I bid you welcome.
I welcome you to my house.
Welcome to my house.
Welcome to my home.
Bela Lugosi had set the image of Count Dracula in the minds of generations of cinema goers. What Hammer did a few decades later was really to set the expectations of what a vampire movie could and should be, almost to the point that they become cliche. Dracula 58 introduces fangs, red contact lenses, décolletage, blood, and the vampire hunter's box of tools, from mirrors and crucifixes to holy water and ready prepared wooden stakes. One of the many ways Hammer's Dracula distinguishes itself from its extremely famous predecessor is the fact that it's shot in colour. And that Technicolor is pushed for all that it's worth. Directed by Terence Fisher with Jack Asher as director of photography. A DP who's never flashy or showy. The frames are warm and rich with colour inside the drawing rooms and bedrooms of our human protagonists, whilst cold and austere inside the walls of the Count's castle. Not that this is a run-down castle, mind you. It's very inviting. It's full of furniture and furnishings, not at all what we would have expected. This is one of a number of ways that Hammer's Dracula completely flips your expectations. There is not a cobweb in sight. And it's not just the lighting that pushes this Technicolor aspect. The sets, the set design, the costumes, everything screams lush, bright, vibrant, vivid. Dracula with his striking, almost silhouette-like and funereal outfit set against Valerie Gaunt and Lucy's diaphanous ghostly gowns. Once these Hammer women become vampires, they rarely spend much time out of their 90s. But if this is a fashion show, then Peter Cushing wins the prize. Van Helsing's coat, my God, that fur-lined coat, and later his purple jacket and waistcoat, simply sublime, style personified. The Dracula story that we had come to expect gets completely shook up for many reasons, not least budgetary reasons. Stoker's sprawling narrative needs to be streamlined down. It would just cost far too much to shoot that book. But we don't want the very stagey drawing room interpersonal drama of the 1931 Dracula. This is a full-throated, red-blooded Dracula. So there are pros and cons to the changes. First and foremost, right up front, this film tells you, after that splash of blood, that this is not the Dracula story that you think you know. Jonathan Harker, yes, he travels to arrive at Castle Dracula, but he already knows who Dracula is. Jonathan Harker is a vampire hunter sent there to kill Dracula. What after this? Everything else is up for grabs. You don't know, even if you know Stoker's novel inside and out, what's going to happen next. Rather than three brides of Dracula, there's a single woman at the castle, Valerie Gaunt, who claims that she's being held prisoner by Dracula and meets Harker in secret a couple of times to gain his trust and his help. That owes more, rather than Stoker's novel, to Powers of Darkness or Mac Micrana, the Icelandic version of Dracula that takes an enormous amount of liberties with Stoker's original text. I don't think that's necessarily by design, it's just a happy coincidence. That doesn't mean that she doesn't try and take a nip out of Harker, she certainly does. And this is the first time really that the film gets to show off how much of an action Dracula Christopher Lee's Count is. Christopher Lee's Count hisses like an animal, snarls, jumps across tables, throws people across rooms. Some of the mix-ups just seem to be changed for change's sake. One of the things that really drives me nuts is the tinkering that always seems to go on with the characters in these adaptations of Dracula. Oh, let's swap Lucy with Mina, and let's swap Arthur with Jonathan, and Seward can come in, or this character can be Seward and Arthur. Shall we have Quincy? No, we'll never have Quincy, apart from the Francis Coppola version. I suppose, though, if you're going to bump Jonathan Harker off in the first portion of the movie, then it maybe makes sense to couple Mina with someone else. Here, Jonathan is engaged to Lucy, not Mina, whilst Mina is already married to Arthur and Lucy is Arthur's sister. Got that? It doesn't really matter. Just watch and enjoy. The other bit of Hammer tinkering that has to be purely budgetary is why they insist on setting their films all in the same vaguely Germanic country. It reduces the scope of Dracula. There's no Harker as a stranger in a strange land. He basically just makes a day's coach ride to go and visit the Count. There's no sense of the Count coming to the New World. There's no trip on the Demeter for the Count to get to reach England again. It's just another short coach ride. It makes Dracula's action seem more reduced somehow. There's no epic sweep to it. He's essentially pissed off that his consort was killed, and so he's going to take the fiancée of the guy who killed her as a replacement. It's a very personal kind of revenge for a Dracula who holds much more stock, I guess, in the sexy times than Lugosi's version ever did, or at least was allowed to. So, whilst it's a much more personalised revenge plan that Dracula has, it's a pretty fucked up plan if you think about it. Harker killed his consort, so Dracula turns him into a vampire, takes a trip across the border to kidnap and turn Lucy, presumably with a view to cuckolding Harker with her right in front of him for the rest of eternity. So we move to Lucy, and for me, Dracula adaptations stand or fall by a number of things. One of those is the quality of their vampire Lucy, and the Hammer film absolutely nails it. In fact, to my mind, the vampire Lucy section of the film is the second best thing in this movie. She's totally down to spiriting away and eating children. Given the fact that they've switched Mina and Lucy around and now made Lucy Arthur's sister, there's even a little hint of incest in the cemetery as she decides to forego the child that she's going to chomp down upon for the chance to neck with her brother. Carol Marsh as Lucy Homewood perfectly plays both sides of the character. The childlike young ingenue introduced to Dracula's darkly sensual world, and then figuratively and literally reborn into a kind of post-mortem womanhood. This film really doubles down on the subtext of Stoker's novel that sees Dracula's, shall we call it, attention, unlocking hitherto buttoned up areas of sexuality. And once Lucy is dispatched with a stake, Dracula moves his attention to the mistress of the house, Mina Homewood, Arthur's wife, played by Melissa Stribling. Poor old stiff and proper Arthur Homewood. Dracula really does fuck his way through this guy's family. Melissa Stribling's performance is perhaps even better than Carol Marsh's. Certainly a little more nuanced. Mina, we must presume, is already, as a married woman, more experienced in the ways of the world than her younger sister-in-law, so the chilling delight that plays across her face after her first encounter with Dracula is definitely one of a woman who's holding on to a delicious secret. Because Dracula's plan is more personal, this becomes a game of wits between he and Van Helsing, the one man who understands Dracula's nature, his strengths, and his weaknesses. Eventually, Van Helsing makes a believer out of Arthur and recruits him to the cause, but it's a joy to see how Dracula is always 2 steps ahead of those in pursuit. Forget the calls coming from inside the house. The freaking Count is visiting at night from inside the house. And what a Count. What can you say about Christopher Lee and Dracula? The two have become synonymous for a reason. He's so vital, animalistic, so alive. As I said earlier, he's an action vampire. He appears in the film for about 9.5 minutes, if you can believe that. Hardly says a word. In later films, he'll say absolutely nothing. But his stamp is all over this movie. His introduction, at the top of the stairs, he fairly bounds down the steps and completely commands your attention as he moves into this close-up, and then says, with his very clipped diction, "I'm Dracula. I welcome you to my house." This is not the Bela Lugosi Count. Another one of the many, many ways, right from the off, pun not intended, that Hammer says, this is a brand new Count for you kids. This isn't your mum and dad's Count. The attack in the library scene that I mentioned sees him absolutely animalistic. Any veneer of this classy aristocrat is absolutely gone. This is a creature of evil, and he is a beast. And then another aspect to him, when he seduces Lucy and Mina, this sort of Byronic, mad, bad and dangerous to know, sexual predator really, but one that they almost desire, want, need. And against a vibrant, energetic Count, you have his equal counterpart in Cushing. It's an absolute joy to watch a young, energetic Cushing really taking on this role with absolute gusto. The Cushing everyone brings to mind is maybe of an older, gaunter man, and it really does pay dividends to go back and watch his performances when he was a younger man. He is every bit as engaged with this movie and this role as Lee is with his nemesis, Count Dracula. All of which pays off in the titanic, fantastic final battle at the end of the movie. If the Vampire Lucy scene, to my mind, is the second best scene in the film, the best scene is the one that they leave to last by an absolute country mile. This is not 1931's Lugosi and Edward Sloane's aging Van Helsing talking at one another. It's not a battle of conversation in a drawing room that they have in 31. This is an absolute slugfest in Castle Dracula as the sun is coming up. It's probably the best Van Helsing Dracula battle that has ever been put down on cinema, and the ending of The Count is absolutely phenomenal. It really captured my imagination as a kid when I saw this movie for the first time, of Cushing picking up those candlesticks and forming them into a cross, pushing him back into that shaft of sunlight where he disintegrates before our eyes. Just the most thrilling ending to a sort of pulse-pounding, stripped-down, streamlined Dracula. Stripped down and streamlined for budgetary reasons, sure, but it makes the film lean, mean. It turns it into, rather than this epistolatory, epic, multiple interweaving narratives that Stoker created, which I love, it turns Dracula into an absolute Corvette, which just fucking, you put the pedal down and it just goes for about 90 minutes. And if you don't cheer at the end of it, you're dead inside, just like the Count is.